Wyoming Territory, 1872. The land was a study in immensity and indifference. It stretched out under a sky so vast it seemed to press down on the world, bleaching the color from the sagebrush and turning the distant mountains into hazy, blue-violet ghosts. Dust, fine as powdered bone, settled on everything, a constant reminder of the earth's dominion. For Caleb Hayes, this emptiness was not a void, but a fortress. Its silence was his shield, its harshness a familiar, honest companion. From the porch of his ranch house, a solid structure of hewn pine that stood defiant against the wind, he watched the world. His world. It was a kingdom of solitude, bounded by barbed wire and the unending horizon. The lowing of his cattle was the only conversation he required. The creak of saddle leather was his only music. He had built this life nail by nail, fence post by fence post, walling himself in as much as he was fencing his herd. It was a good life, he told himself. A safe one. Attachments were snares for the unwary, anchors that dragged a man down into the murky depths of loss. He had learned that lesson once, written in blood and tears, and he would not need to learn it again. His gaze drifted east toward the thin silver lines of the railroad track that cut a surgical scar across the prairie. Twice a week, the train brought the noise and clutter of the outside world to the nearby town of Redemption, a place he visited only when necessity demanded. He could hear its whistle now, a mournful cry swallowed by the sheer scale of the landscape. It was a sound he usually dismissed, a fleeting intrusion. But today, for a reason he could not name, it snagged in his mind. It sounded less like an arrival and more like a warning. He felt a disquiet settle in his bones, a subtle shift in the air, as if a storm was gathering far beyond the visible horizon. He dismissed it as foolishness, a phantom of his own making. Loneliness, he knew, could play tricks on a mind. He turned his attention back to the familiar, comforting sight of his herd grazing peacefully in the distance, their dark shapes stark against the pale, dry grass. The steam hissed and billowed, clouding the platform in a damp, coal-scented fog. Eleanor Vance stepped down from the carriage, her hand clutching the worn handle of her valise. The fine wool of her traveling suit, a deep forest green that had seemed so practical in Philadelphia, felt heavy and out of place here. It was coated in a fine layer of ochre dust that seemed to have worked its way into the very weave of the fabric. She took a breath, and the air was thin and sharp, tasting of grit and something wild like pine and distance. It was a world away from the damp, crowded air of the city she had left behind. Her eyes, the color of warm honey, scanned the small cluster of people on the platform. Men in sturdy, dirt-stained trousers and wide-brimmed hats. A few women in practical calico dresses, their faces weathered by sun and wind. She was looking for a Mr. Thompson, the man whose carefully worded advertisement in the Philadelphia Chronicle had been her last, desperate hope. A position as a governess for his two young daughters. A new life. A chance to escape the pitying glances and the suffocating charity of her late husband's family. But among the faces, there was no one who looked like they were waiting for anyone. Her heart, which had been a frantic drum against her ribs for the entire journey, began a slower, heavier beat of dread. The station master, a harried man with a kind face and spectacles perched on the end of his nose, approached her. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his voice a gentle rumble. "I am looking for a Mr. Thompson," she said, her own voice sounding fragile, breakable. "He was to meet me here, to take me to his ranch. I am to be the governess for his children." The man, Silas, pushed his spectacles up. "Thompson?" He shook his head slowly. "Can't say I know the name. There's a Thompson, with no P, runs a freight business over in Laramie, but he's an old bachelor. No children." He looked at her, his expression softening with concern. "Are you certain this is the place, miss?" "Redemption, Wyoming Territory," she confirmed, her voice wavering. She pulled a folded, creased letter from her reticule. The paper was soft with handling. The address was clear. Her hope, which had been a flickering candle flame, was now guttering, threatening to be extinguished by the vast, indifferent wind. She was alone. truly and utterly alone, in a place that felt like the edge of the world, with less than $5 to her name. The carefully constructed facade of her future was dissolving like a mirage, leaving only the stark, terrifying reality of her predicament. Caleb tied his horse, Apollo, to the hitching post in front of the general store. The twice-weekly trip to Redemption was a necessary evil. He needed salt licks for the cattle and a new sack of flour for Martha, his housekeeper. He moved with an economy of motion, his body lean and hard from years of physical labor. His face was all sharp angles and sun-weathered plains, his eyes the color of a stormy sky, watchful and guarded. He preferred the silent company of his land to the noise and gossip of the town. As he stepped onto the boardwalk, his gaze fell upon the woman standing alone by the deserted train platform. She was a stark slash of dark green against the town's palette of brown and beige. Even from a distance, he could see the fine cut of her clothes, the proud set of her shoulders, and the lost, bewildered expression on her face. She was from the East. It was as plain as if she had been branded with it. A delicate thing, he thought, utterly unsuited for this unforgiving country. He felt a brief, unwelcome pang of something that might have been pity, but he smothered it. Her troubles were not his. He had enough ghosts of his own to contend with. He went about his business, the weight of his own solitude a familiar cloak. But as he exited the store, flour sacks slung over one shoulder, he saw her still standing there. The platform was empty now, save for her, and two men, drifters by the look of them, were now loitering nearby, their eyes fixed on her with a predatory interest. They were the kind of men who fed on vulnerability. Caleb's jaw tightened. He had seen that look before. He had seen what it led to. A cold, quiet anger began to smolder deep inside him. He had no intention of getting involved. He had a code. Mind his own business, expect others to do the same. But as one of the men took a step toward her, a greasy smile spreading across his face, Caleb found his feet moving of their own accord. He set the flour sack down with a soft thud. He did not want to do this. He did not want to speak to her, to be drawn into her orbit, to have his carefully ordered world disturbed. Yet, he could not simply walk away. The part of him that was decent, the part he tried so hard to bury, would not allow it. Just as he approached, a gust of wind, a common and sudden affliction of the high plains, whipped across the platform. It snatched a small, leather-bound book from her grasp, sending it tumbling through the dust. She cried out, a small sound of distress, and lunged for it. Caleb was closer. He bent down in a single, fluid motion, his gloved hand closing over the book just as her own bare fingers reached it. Their hands brushed. For a fleeting second, his leather-clad fingers touched the back of her hand. It was a jolt, sharp and unexpected, like lightning striking a wire fence. The warmth of her skin seemed to burn through the thick hide of his glove, a shock of life that momentarily stunned him. He straightened up, the book in his hand. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. Her honey-colored eyes were wide, startled, and shimmering with unshed tears. Dust clung to the fine strands of honey-blonde hair that had escaped her neat chignon. She was more than just a delicate thing. There was a fire in her, a strength in the set of her jaw, even in her despair. "You dropped this," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, a gravelly sound that seemed to surprise even him. "Thank you," she breathed, her hands still hovering in the air between them. She took the book, her fingers brushing his again, another small electric shock. I seem to be in some difficulty. This ain't a place for difficulty," he stated bluntly, his gaze flickering toward the two men who were now watching them with sullen curiosity. "The boarding house is likely full. The next train ain't for 3 days." He was not trying to be cruel, only practical. This was a land of hard facts, not soft sentiments. Eleanor flinched at his tone. He sounded as harsh and unforgiving as the landscape itself. "I'm aware of the facts, sir," she said, a touch of frost entering her voice. "I was merely hoping for a solution, not a recitation of my troubles." Her pride, though battered, was not broken. A corner of Caleb's mouth twitched. She had spirit. He had to give her that. "The only solution here is to have a place to go before you arrive," he said, his gaze fixed on some point over her shoulder. He could not keep looking into her eyes. It felt too much like looking into a fire, and he had learned long ago not to get too close to the flames. He turned to leave, his duty done. He had retrieved her book. He had warned her, in his own gruff way. The rest was not his concern. It could not be. Sheriff Brody found him loading his supplies into his wagon. Brody was a man whose comfortable girth and easy smile belied a sharp mind and a steady hand. He had been Sheriff of Redemption for 15 years and knew its people and its secrets better than anyone. "Caleb," he said, hooking his thumbs into his belt. "Saw you talking to the new arrival," she stranded. Caleb grunted, not looking at him. "Waiting on a man who don't exist, I know," Brody said quietly. "Silas told me. She tried the boarding house. Full up. She's got no money to speak of and nowhere to go." He paused, letting the words hang in the dry air. "You've got a big house, Caleb, and Martha's there. It would all be proper." Caleb froze, his hand on a sack of oats. He turned to face the sheriff, his expression a mask of granite. "No," the word was flat and absolute. "My ranch ain't a charity house for lost birds from the east. She's not a bird, Caleb. She's a woman in trouble," Brody countered gently. "What am I supposed to do? Let her sleep in my office? Let those 2 coyotes you scared off earlier circle back?" The image of her, alone and vulnerable, flashed in Caleb's mind. He saw again the shimmer of tears in her eyes, felt the phantom warmth of her hand against his. He hated the feeling. He hated that it had lodged itself in his memory. "It's not my concern," he repeated, but the words felt hollow. "Since when is a woman's safety not the concern of a good man?" Brody asked, his voice losing its easy tone. "I know you've built walls around yourself, son. High ones. But there are some things a man can't wall himself off from. Decency is one of them." Caleb said nothing. He stared out at the dusty main street, at the unforgiving glare of the afternoon sun. He was trapped by his own code of honor, the very thing he used to justify his isolation. To turn her away now, knowing her situation, would be a cruelty he could not live with, and that fact infuriated him. It was a violation of the neat, ordered world he had constructed. She was a disruption, a complication, a crack in his fortress. Finally, with a sigh that sounded like the grinding of stones, he surrendered. "Fine," he bit out. "Tell her. But it's temporary, just until the next train. Martha will see to her." He turned his back on Brody, a clear dismissal, and finished loading his wagon with sharp, angry movements. He felt as if he had just willingly unlocked a door he had spent years barring shut. The ride to the ranch was a study in strained silence. Eleanor sat beside him on the wagon bench, her back ramrod straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was mortified by her circumstance, dependent on the charity of a stranger, and a brusque, unwelcoming one at that. She stole glances at him from beneath the brim of her bonnet. His profile was stark against the endless sky, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if she were not there at all. He handled the horses with a quiet, confident command that was almost hypnotic. He seemed a part of this land, carved from the same rock and wood as his surroundings. Caleb was acutely aware of her presence. The faint, clean scent of lavender that clung to her clothes was a foreign invader in his world of dust, leather, and pine. He could feel the slight warmth of her body, though they were not touching. It was a distraction, an irritation. He drove the team harder, wanting only to reach the ranch, deposit her with Martha, and retreat back into the comfortable shell of his solitude. Every mile felt like a concession. Every creak of the wagon wheels a countdown to a disruption he could not control. The ranch house appeared suddenly, nestled in a shallow valley that offered some protection from the relentless wind. It was larger than Eleanor had expected, simple and sturdy, with a wide porch and windows that looked out over the vast expanse. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a welcoming plume against the pale sky. As they pulled up, an older woman came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. Her hair was gray, pulled into a neat bun, and her face was lined with kindness. "Martha, this is Miss Vance," Caleb said, his voice clipped. She'll be staying for a few days. In the spare room, Martha's warm brown eyes took in Eleanor's dusty clothes and exhausted face with a single, compassionate glance. Of course. Welcome, dear. You look all done in. Come inside. I've got stew on the stove and the bed is aired. She came down the steps and took Eleanor's arm, her touch firm and reassuring. It was the first genuine kindness Eleanor had felt in weeks, and she had to fight back a sudden, overwhelming urge to weep. Caleb unloaded her single valise and set it inside the door. I have chores, he announced to the room at large, and then he was gone, striding toward the barn without a backward glance. He left behind a profound silence, filled only by the ticking of a mantel clock and the scent of wood smoke and simmering stew. Martha led Eleanor to a room upstairs. It was simple but immaculately clean. A patchwork quilt in shades of blue and white was folded neatly on the bed. A wash basin and pitcher stood on a small stand. You get yourself settled and washed up, Martha said gently. Dinner will be ready soon. Don't you worry about Mr. Hayes. His bark has always been worse than his bite. Left alone, Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed. The mattress was firm, the room quiet. The silence here was different from the silence of the open prairie. It was a domestic silence, a peaceful one. Through the window, she could see the vast, empty landscape stretching to the horizon. She felt like a castaway washed ashore on a strange and desolate island, taken in by its grim, solitary king. She was safe for now, but she was no closer to a future than she had been on the train platform. She was adrift, and her only port in the storm was a man who looked at her as if she were a ghost. Dinner was a tense affair. The three of them sat at a long, polished pine table in the main room. A fire crackled in the large stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Caleb ate with a focused intensity, his eyes on his plate. He seemed to have erected an invisible wall around himself, one that was impossible to breach. Martha, however, was not so easily deterred. She kept up a gentle stream of chatter about the ranch, the weather, and the goings-on in town, her words like smooth stones dropped into a still, deep pond. She asked Eleanor about her journey, about Philadelphia, her questions careful and kind. It is very different from here. Eleanor managed, her voice small. I imagine so, Martha said with a smile. This land asks a lot of a person, but gives back, too. In its own way. After the meal, Caleb rose. I'll see to the horses, he said, the same excuse as before. He vanished into the cool night, leaving the two women alone in the warm glow of the firelight. Don't mind him, Martha said, beginning to clear the plates. He wasn't always like this. The world took a piece of him, and he's never figured out how to live without it. Eleanor felt a flicker of curiosity, but it was not her place to ask. She stood to help. Please let me, she insisted. I cannot accept your hospitality without contributing in some way. Martha hesitated, then handed her a dish towel. They worked in companionable silence for a few moments. Then, under the gentle, non-judgmental gaze of the older woman, the dam of Eleanor's composure finally broke. The story of her husband's sudden death from fever, the discovery of his massive debts, the cold, swift cruelty of his brother who had seized their home and all their assets, leaving her with nothing but a few dresses and a handful of dollars. It all came pouring out in a hushed, trembling torrent. The lie about the governess position was the most humiliating confession of all. I was so desperate, she whispered, her face buried in her hands. I saw the advertisement, and I clung to it. I built a whole future on a foundation of sand. Martha put a comforting arm around her shoulders. Caleb stood in the shadows of the porch, just outside the open doorway. He had come back for a forgotten tool, but he had stopped when he heard Eleanor's trembling voice. He heard it all, every painful, humiliating detail. He had intended to retreat, to grant them their privacy, but he found himself rooted to the spot. Her vulnerability was a raw, open wound, and something inside him, something he thought long dead, ached in sympathy. He remembered another woman's tears, another life shattered by sudden, brutal loss. His wife, Sarah. The fever that swept through their small homestead 5 years ago taking her and their infant son in the space of a week. He remembered the helplessness, the rage, the crushing, silent emptiness that followed. He had sold that place, unable to bear the ghosts, and had come here to this vast, empty land to build a fortress against feeling anything like that ever again. Now, this woman, this stranger, had brought the echo of that pain into his fortress. He saw in her the same desperate courage he had seen in Sarah. He saw the same unfairness of a world that could be so cruel. He quietly backed away from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He retreated to the barn, to the familiar, comforting smells of hay and horse, but the sound of her quiet sobs followed him. For the first time in 5 years, the walls of his solitude felt less like a fortress and more like a prison. The next morning, Eleanor awoke with a renewed, if fragile, sense of purpose. She would not be a burden. She dressed in her plainest dress and went downstairs to find Martha already kneading dough in the kitchen. "Good morning," Eleanor said, her voice clear. "Please, show me what I can do. I'm a quick learner." Martha smiled, a pleased, knowing look in her eyes. "Well, the chickens need seeing too, and there's mending to be done." "If you're sure I am," Eleanor said firmly. Caleb watched from a distance as she navigated the unfamiliar terrain of the chicken coop, her movements initially hesitant, then more confident. He saw her later, sitting on the porch with Martha, a needle and thread in her hand, her brow furrowed in concentration as she mended one of his shirts. She was not the fragile, helpless creature he had first assumed. There was a core of steel beneath that refined exterior, a resilience that this harsh land demanded, but that he had not expected her to possess. He found himself watching her more than he watched his cattle. It was an unsettling, disruptive feeling. Days settled into a strange rhythm. Eleanor worked alongside Martha, learning the endless, cyclical chores of ranch life. She collected eggs, tended the small vegetable garden, kneaded bread, and scrubbed floors. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to holding nothing heavier than a teacup, became chapped and calloused. But with each new skill she learned, she felt a piece of her old, helpless self sloughing away. She was earning her keep. She was surviving. And in the quiet evenings, she would read from the book Caleb had rescued for her, a volume of poetry, her soft voice filling the silent room. Caleb maintained his distance, but he was always aware of her. He found himself listening for the sound of her voice, for the light tread of her footsteps. During one meal, she began asking him questions about the land, about the names of the wildflowers that grew in stubborn clumps near the creek, about the habits of the antelope that sometimes grazed near his herd. Her curiosity was genuine, her questions intelligent. "Why did you choose to settle here?" she asked one evening, her gaze direct. "It's so empty." He looked up from his plate, surprised by the directness of the question. He had expected her to complain about the isolation, not to question its appeal. "It's honest," he said after a long moment. "The land doesn't lie to you. It doesn't make promises it can't keep." He was talking about more than just the land, and he thought for a moment that she understood. "But it must be lonely," she pressed gently. "I prefer it," he said, the walls sliding back into place. But the words sounded less convincing to his own ears than they had a week ago. He saw the flicker of hurt in her eyes before she looked away, and it bothered him more than it should have. He was beginning to see the woman, not just the complication. He saw her strength, her intelligence, her quiet courage. And it was starting to scare him more than any physical threat ever could. The first sign of real trouble came a week after Eleanor's arrival. Sheriff Brody rode out to the ranch, his expression unusually grim. Caleb met him by the corral. "Those 2 men," Brody began without preamble, "the ones who were watching Miss Vance at the station. They're still in town. A couple of hard cases named Finn and Pike. They've been asking questions, not just about her, but about her late husband. About money." Caleb's entire body went rigid. "What kind of money?" "They seem to have a notion her husband left her a fortune, and that she's run off with it," Brody said, scratching his jaw. "They mentioned her brother-in-law. Seems he's the one who sent them. He's offered them a cut of whatever they recover." A cold fury washed over Caleb. He thought of Eleanor's tearful confession. There was no fortune. Her brother-in-law had taken everything. This was a cruel fiction, a greedy man's fantasy that had now put her in very real danger. These men were not just drifters, they were hunters. And she was their prey. "They know she's here?" Caleb asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Not for certain," Brody admitted. "But Redemption is a small town. It won't take them long to figure it out. I've warned them to stay clear of you, but they're the kind that don't take warnings well. You need to be careful, Caleb." Both of you, after Brody left, Caleb stood for a long time, staring out at the vast, empty prairie. His fortress had been breached. The danger he had sensed on the wind the day she arrived was no longer a phantom. It was real, and it had a name: Finn and Pike. He felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it stole his breath. It was an old, familiar feeling, one he had associated only with pain and loss. He had failed to protect Sarah and his son. He would not fail again. The thought was a vow, sworn to the silent, watchful land. He became a shadow, his vigilance a constant, humming tension. He cleaned and oiled his rifle and his revolver, the actions methodical and calming. He began carrying the revolver on his hip again, something he hadn't done on his own land in years. He watched the horizon, his eyes scanning for any sign of riders. Eleanor noticed the change in him immediately. The quiet distance had been replaced by a coiled, watchful stillness. The air around him crackled with a new intensity. "Is something wrong?" she asked him that evening, her voice laced with concern. He did not want to frighten her. He did not want to see that look of fear in her eyes. "Just some trouble with rustlers in the area," he lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Nothing to worry about, but she knew he was lying. She could see it in the way his gaze kept sweeping the landscape, in the way his hand sometimes rested on the butt of the gun at his hip. She did not press him. She simply became more observant herself, a quiet ally in a battle she did not understand. She found that the fear she should have felt was overshadowed by a strange sense of security. With Caleb watching over them, she felt safer than she had in months. The confrontation he had been expecting came 2 days later. Eleanor, feeling restless, had decided to take a walk along the creek that bordered the property. It was a ribbon of green in the brown landscape, lined with cottonwoods whose leaves shimmered like silver coins in the breeze. She was gathering a small bouquet of purple wildflowers when she heard the sound of horses. 2 men emerged from the trees on the far side of the creek. They were the men from the train station. She recognized them instantly. The one called Finn, tall and thin with a weasel-like face, gave her a yellow-toothed grin. The other, Pike, was broad and brutish, his eyes small and mean. "Well, look what we have here," Finn said, his voice oily. "The little lost bird. We've been looking all over for you." Mrs. Vance Eleanor's blood ran cold. They knew her name. She took an involuntary step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I don't know you," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "Please leave me alone." "Oh, we can't do that," Pike grunted, dismounting. "Your brother-in-law, Mr. Abernathy, he's very worried about you, and about the money our dear departed Mr. Vance left behind. He sent us to escort you, and back home." He started to splash across the shallow creek, his intentions clear. Eleanor turned to run, but her feet felt as if they were rooted in the mud. A scream was trapped in her throat. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the air, the thunder of hooves. Caleb appeared as if from nowhere, riding Apollo at a full gallop. He reined the powerful horse to a skidding halt between Eleanor and the men, kicking up a spray of water and mud. Apollo reared slightly, his eyes wild, a perfect extension of his rider's fury. "Get off my land!" Caleb's voice was deadly quiet, more menacing than any shout. His hand was resting on the grip of his revolver. Finn's smile faltered. He had not counted on this. "This ain't your business, rancher. We have business with the lady. She's on my land." "That makes her my business," Caleb said, his gaze as cold and hard as river stone. "I'll say it one more time. Get off my land." Pike, halfway across the creek, hesitated. He looked from Caleb's icy expression to the gun at his hip and back again. He was a bully, not a fool. He slowly backed away. Finn held Caleb's gaze for a long moment, his eyes filled with malice. Then he jerked his head at Pike. They turned their horses and rode away, melting back into the trees. They did not look back. The moment they were gone, the tension drained out of Caleb. He swung down from his horse, his movements stiff. He turned to Eleanor. She was pale, her eyes huge in her face, the small bunch of wildflowers crushed in her fist. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice still rough. She could only nod, unable to speak. The terror was only now catching up with her, making her tremble. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently took her arm. "Come on," he said softly. "I'm taking you back to the house." His touch was firm, grounding. He helped her onto Apollo's back, then swung up behind her, his body a solid, warm wall against her back. He wrapped one arm around her waist to hold her steady, and the contact sent a tremor through her that had nothing to do with fear. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder blades, smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him. In that moment, held securely in his arms, the vast, terrifying emptiness of Wyoming seemed to recede. For the first time, she felt as if she might have found a place to belong. Caleb, for his part, was in turmoil. Holding her like this, her slight form pressed against his chest, was both agony and a strange, forgotten kind of bliss. Her hair, smelling faintly of lavender and sunshine, brushed against his chin. He could feel the tremors that ran through her. Every protective instinct he possessed roared to life. He wanted to keep her here, safe, where he could watch over her. But the incident at the creek had proven the opposite. His proximity was the very thing that had put her in the path of danger. They had found her because she was with him. The realization was a cold knife in his gut. The journey back to the ranch house was short and silent, but charged with an unspoken current of emotion. When they arrived, he helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Martha rushed out onto the porch, her face etched with worry. "I saw them ride off," she said, hurting Eleanor inside. The devil's own Caleb didn't follow. He stood by his horse, stroking Apollo's neck, his thoughts a maelstrom. He had brought danger to his door. Worse, he had brought it to hers. The old, familiar litany began in his head. Attachments are a weakness. They make you vulnerable. They get people hurt. He had let his guard down, allowed this woman to slip past his defenses, and now she was a target because of it. The only way to protect her, the only logical, rational way, was to send her away. The decision settled in his heart like a stone. It was the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do. It was also the hardest thing he had ever forced himself to consider. The thought of the house falling silent again, of her absence at the dinner table, of the empty chair by the fire, was a physical pain. But her safety was more important than his comfort. He had failed to keep his family safe once. He would not make that mistake again, even if the cost was his own heart. That evening, the atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken tension. Eleanor had recovered her composure, but a new anxiety shadowed her eyes. She knew the men would be back. Caleb was silent and withdrawn, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He had retreated so far into himself that he seemed to be in another room entirely. After dinner, when Martha had discreetly retired for the night, he finally spoke. He did not look at Eleanor, but stared into the dancing flames of the fire. "I'm taking you into town tomorrow," he said, his voice flat. "I'll buy you a ticket on the next train east." Back to Philadelphia, Eleanor stared at him, her heart stopping. The words were a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. "What? Why?" she stammered. "It's not safe for you here," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "Those men, they found you because you're here. With me. The only way to ensure your safety is for you to leave." He was laying out the logic of it, as if it were a simple matter of logistics, a problem to be solved with a train ticket. Hurt, sharp and blinding, lanced through her. After everything, after the shared chores, the quiet conversations, the moment of terror at the creek when he had been her fierce protector, he was just sending her away, like a piece of luggage. "And what am I to do in Philadelphia?" she demanded, her voice rising with a mixture of pain and anger. Return to the charity of a man who sent thugs to hunt me down? You would send me back to that. I will give you money, he said, still not looking at her. Enough to get you settled. Find a new place. I don't want your money, she cried, jumping to her feet. I thought I was finding a place here. The confession hung in the air, fragile and shimmering. I will not be sent away like a child. I am not some delicate thing to be shipped back east for my own good. This is my decision to make, not yours. Finally, he looked at her. His eyes were filled with a bleak, haunted anguish that stunned her into silence. You don't understand, he said, his voice cracking. I can't. I won't be responsible for what might happen to you. His gaze flickered for a moment, looking past her at some unseen horror. I've buried a family once. I won't do it again. The raw pain in his voice, the glimpse into the profound trauma that had shaped him, silenced her anger. This wasn't a rejection of her. It was a desperate, misguided attempt to protect them both from a ghost that haunted him. He was pushing her away not because he didn't care, but because he was terrified that he did. Your past is not our future, Caleb, she said softly, her heart aching for him. Running away is not the answer. It's the only answer I have, he said, his voice flat again as the mask of stoicism slid back into place. Be ready to leave after breakfast. He stood and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the crackling fire and the shattering pieces of the hope she had allowed herself to build. She sank back in her chair, tears of frustration and sorrow tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. She would not go. She did not know how she would stop him, but she would not let him send her away. This was the first place she had felt a glimmer of home, and she would fight for it. The night was unnaturally still. The wind had died down, and the silence that pressed in on the ranch house was heavy and absolute. Caleb lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. Every word of their argument replayed in his mind. The hurt in her eyes, the defiant strength in her voice. Your past is not our future. The words were a brand on his soul. Was she right? Was he letting the ghosts of his past dictate his future, condemning himself to a lifetime of empty rooms and silent meals? The thought was unbearable, but the fear of losing someone again was a physical, choking presence. Sending her away was like tearing out a part of himself, but keeping her here felt like putting a target on her back. Eleanor, in her room, had not even tried to sleep. She had packed her small valise, not in preparation to leave, but as an act of defiance. If he forced her out, she would not go meekly. She sat in the chair by the window, watching the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the yard. A profound sadness settled over her. She had misjudged him. The kindness she had seen, the protection he had offered, she had mistaken it for the beginning of something more. Now she saw it was merely the reflex of a decent man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. The thought that she would be on a train in less than 12 hours, heading back toward a life she no longer wanted, was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. It was the smell of smoke that first alerted Caleb. Not the familiar, comforting scent of wood smoke from the hearth, but the acrid, greasy smell of burning hay. He was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers and grabbing the rifle he kept propped against the wall. He moved to the window and looked toward the barn. A hellish orange glow was licking at the edges of the roof. A diversion. The thought was immediate and chilling. At that exact moment, a gunshot shattered the night's stillness, followed by the splintering of wood as a bullet tore through the front door. "Hayes!" A voice yelled from the darkness. It was Finn. "Send the woman out, and the money, or we'll burn you out." Caleb's blood ran cold. They were here. His indecision, his fear, had brought this down upon them. There was no more time for doubt. There was only action. He burst out of his room and met Eleanor in the hallway. She was pale, but her eyes were not filled with terror. They were filled with a fierce, resolute light. "Stay here. Bar the door. Stay away from the windows," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Caleb, the barn." "The horses," she cried, her hand gripping his arm. "I know," he gritted out. "They're trying to draw me out." He looked at her, his gaze intense. In that moment, all the walls, all the fear, all the logic he had clung to became meaningless. All that mattered was the woman standing before him. "I am sorry, Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong. I should never have tried to send you away." Before she could respond, he was moving. He crept down the stairs, keeping low. Another shot rang out, this one shattering an upstairs window. He needed to get outside, to use the darkness and his knowledge of the land to his advantage. He slipped out the back door, into the kitchen garden, and melted into the shadows. Eleanor did not bar the door. She would not cower inside while Caleb fought for her, while the animals that were his livelihood were in danger. Her mind raced. The diversion. They wanted to draw Caleb toward the barn, which meant they would be focused on the front of the house, waiting for him to emerge. She ran to the back door, the one Caleb had just used. Peeking out, she saw the orange flames consuming the barn roof, a horrifying, beautiful spectacle. Panic seized her for a second, but then her resolve hardened. She would not be a helpless victim. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the stove. It was ridiculously heavy, but it felt solid and real in her hands. She crept out into the garden, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could hear the men's voices, low and guttural, from the front of the house. While they watched the front, she would deal with the fire. Caleb circled around the edge of the property, using the corral fence as cover. He could see two figures in the moonlight near the front porch. Finn and Pike. There might be more. He raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel. The distance was manageable, but the light was tricky. He needed a clean shot. As he was taking aim, a movement near the barn caught his eye. It was Eleanor. She was running toward the well, a bucket in her hand. A wave of pure terror washed over him. What was she doing? He wanted to scream her name, to tell her to get back, but it would give away his position. He watched, his heart in his throat, as she worked the pump with frantic energy, filled the bucket, and hauled it, sloshing, toward the barn. She threw the water on the flames licking at the barn door, then ran back for more. Her courage was a stunning, breathtaking thing. It was also suicidally reckless, but it gave him an idea. Their attention would be divided. He shifted his position, moving closer, using the water trough as cover. Inside the barn, the horses were screaming, their panic cries tearing at Eleanor's heart. She managed to douse the flames nearest the door, her arms aching, her lungs burning from the smoke. She fumbled with the heavy wooden bar on the door, her hands clumsy with adrenaline. Finally, it gave way. She threw the doors open, and a wave of heat and smoke billowed out. "Go! Go!" she screamed, waving her arms. The terrified animals thundered out into the night, galloping away from the fire and into the safety of the open pasture. Her actions had not gone unnoticed. "What the hell?" Pike growled from the front of the house. He saw her silhouetted against the fire. "It's the woman. Grab her." He started to run toward her, leaving Finn to watch the house. Caleb saw him coming. "Eleanor, get down," he roared. He fired. The rifle shot cracked through the night, and Pike cried out, stumbling and falling to the ground, clutching his leg. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. Finn spun around at the sound of the shot, firing blindly into the darkness where the muzzle flash had been. The bullet whizzed past Caleb's head, thudding into the water trough. Caleb ducked, his mind racing. One down, one to go. But where was he? Finn had disappeared into the shadows near the porch. Eleanor had dropped to the ground as Caleb had commanded. Her ears were ringing. She saw Pike on the ground, groaning. She saw Caleb hunkered down by the trough. And she saw Finn slipping around the side of the house, trying to circle around and get behind Caleb. He was going to ambush him. There was no time to shout a warning. No time for anything but instinct. She scrambled to her feet. A pile of firewood was stacked against the side of the barn. She grabbed a thick, heavy log, her hands raw and splintered. It was all she could do. She ran, her breath sobbing in her chest, on a collision course with the man who was stalking Caleb. Caleb knew he was in a bad spot. He couldn't see Finn. He risked a glance over the trough and saw nothing. He knew the man was flanking him. He was exposed. He prepared to roll, to make a desperate dash for better cover, when he heard a frantic scrambling sound behind him. Finn stepped out from behind the corner of the house, his pistol raised, a triumphant sneer on his face. He had Caleb dead to rights. End of the line, rancher, he hissed. At that exact moment, Eleanor appeared out of the darkness like an avenging angel. With a desperate cry, she swung the heavy log with all her might. It connected with the back of Finn's head with a sickening crack. His eyes went wide with surprise, the sneer dissolving into a look of stupid shock. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the sky as he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the groans of the man on the ground, and Eleanor's ragged breathing. Caleb stared, his rifle still raised, at the scene before him. Eleanor stood over the fallen man. The log dropped at her feet, her chest heaving, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide and luminous in the firelight. She had saved him. This woman he had called a delicate thing, this woman he had tried to send away for her own safety, had just saved his life. The last of his walls, the last of his resistance, shattered like glass against stone. The fear of loss was eclipsed by the terrifying, overwhelming, magnificent reality of what he had almost thrown away. He lowered the rifle and went to her. He didn't run. He walked, his steps deliberate, his eyes never leaving her face. He reached her, and his hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs gently wiping away the soot from her cheeks. He searched her eyes, her face, for any sign of injury, his expression one of raw, unguarded emotion. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice thick and hoarse. "No," she whispered, her body trembling now that the danger was past. "Are you?" He shook his head, a small, wondrous movement. He looked from her to the unconscious man on the ground, to the smoldering barn, to the wide, starry sky above. Everything he thought he knew, every rule he had lived by, had been incinerated in the events of the last 10 minutes. Solitude wasn't strength, it was a cage, and he had almost let the most extraordinary person he had ever met walk out of his life, because he was too afraid to leave it. "I was wrong," he said, his voice choked with a feeling so powerful it was a physical ache in his chest. "About everything. I told you to run. I tried to make you run." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, as if he would never let go. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of lavender and smoke. "But if you ever run again, Eleanor, I'm running with you. Because I am never, ever letting you go." He pulled back just enough to look in her eyes. The firelight danced in their honey-colored depths. "I love you," he said, the words torn from the deepest, most guarded part of his soul. "I think I started loving you the moment you stood on that platform and refused to break." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of overwhelming relief, of a profound and startling joy. After all the loss, all the desperation, all the loneliness, she was home. She had found it in the most unexpected of places, in the heart of this solitary, wounded man. "I love you too, Caleb," she whispered, her voice catching. "I think I have from the moment you picked up my book and looked at me like I was a puzzle you had to solve." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of promises made and a future claimed from the ashes. It was the kiss of a man who had been starving and had just been offered a feast, the kiss of a woman who had been lost and had just been found. Around them, the barn smoldered, a man lay wounded, and the night was full of the aftermath of violence. But in the circle of their arms, a new world was being born, quiet and whole, and filled with a light that no darkness could ever extinguish. The dawn broke clear and cold, painting the eastern sky in shades of pale rose and gold. The air was sharp and clean, washed of the night smoke. Sheriff Brody had come and gone, taking a sullen Finn and a whimpering Pike into custody. The fire in the barn had been reduced to a heap of blackened, steaming timbers. The horses, calmed by Caleb's steady voice, were safe in the corral. A fragile peace had settled over the ranch. Eleanor and Caleb sat on the porch steps, mugs of hot coffee warming their hands. They had not slept. They had talked, sharing the stories that had shaped them, filling in the silent spaces that had existed between them. He told her about Sarah and their son, Daniel, his voice quiet and heavy with memory. But for the first time, it was a story of love and loss, not a secret wound to be hidden away. She listened, her heart aching for the man he had been and the man he was becoming. Caleb looked at the ruins of his barn. It was a testament to his life's work, now a smoking ruin. But he felt no despair. It was just wood and nails. It could be rebuilt. What he had almost lost, what he had gained in its place, was infinitely more precious. He turned to Eleanor. The morning light caught the gold in her hair and traced the elegant line of her jaw. She looked tired, smudged, and utterly beautiful. "Eleanor," he began, his voice serious. He set his mug down and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, a perfect fit. "Why, I said last night. I meant every word. My life before you was gray. I didn't even realize it until you brought the color back. You had to find the color in yourself, Caleb," she said softly. I just held the lamp. He shook his head. "You were the lamp." He reached into the small pocket of his waistcoat and pulled something out. It was a ring. A simple, delicate gold band, worn smooth with time, holding a tiny, deep blue sapphire. "This was my grandmother's," he said, his voice growing thick. "She gave it to my mother, who gave it to me to hold for the right person, for the woman who would be the heart of this home." He looked into her eyes, his own stormy gaze clear and certain. "I know this is fast. I know this place is a half-wild mess, and my barn is a pile of ash. It's not much to offer, but I'm offering all of it. Everything I am, everything I have, and everything I will ever be. Eleanor Vance, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here?" Tears streamed freely down Eleanor's face as she looked from the ring, a small star of blue and gold in his calloused palm, to the raw hope in his eyes. She thought of the life she had left, a life of suffocating expectations and fragile security. She thought of the life she had found, a life of hard work, stark beauty, and a love that was as fierce and true as the land itself. There was no choice to be made. The choice had been made for her the moment he had pulled her onto his horse, the moment she had swung that log, the moment he had declared his love amidst the smoke and ruin. "Yes," she breathed, the word a prayer of thanks. "Oh, Caleb." Yes, he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of such tender reverence that it made her heart swell. The sun was fully risen now, flooding the valley with golden light. It glinted off the new ring on her finger, a promise of all the sunrises they would share. The town of redemption, which had been a source of gossip and speculation, embraced the news with surprising warmth. When Caleb and Eleanor rode in a week later for a simple ceremony at the small church, they found a community waiting. Martha had spread the word, and Sheriff Brody had filled in the heroic details of the fight. The story of the refined Eastern lady and the solitary rancher who had saved each other had captured the town's imagination. They were no longer a complication and a loner. They were a story of courage and love. The women from the town had helped Martha sew a simple but beautiful wedding dress for Eleanor from bolts of cream-colored linen. The men, organized by Sheriff Brody, presented Caleb with a promise. They would be out at his ranch the following Saturday to help him raise a new barn. It was the frontier way, community rising from the ashes of disaster. As Eleanor stood beside Caleb in the small, sunlit church, she looked at the weathered, kind faces of the townspeople who had gathered to witness their union. She was no longer a stranger, an outsider. She had found her people. After the ceremony, as they prepared to head back to the ranch, Silas, the station master, approached them, his face beaming. "Just wanted to offer my congratulations," he said. "Never was so glad to be wrong about a man, not existing." Eleanor laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that made Caleb's heart ache in the best possible way. He took her hand, the gold band on her finger a warm, solid presence against his skin. He looked at his wife, at the life that stretched before them, as vast and full of promise as the Wyoming sky. The fortress of his solitude had fallen, and in its place he had built a home. 2 years later, the Wyoming sun, now a familiar friend, warmed the new, wider porch of the expanded ranch house. Where there had once been only dust and stubborn weeds, a vibrant garden now bloomed, a testament to Eleanor's patient hands. Roses climbed a trellis against the house, their scent mingling with the ever-present perfume of pine and sage. The new barn stood proud and strong, larger than the one it had replaced, a symbol not of one man's labor, but of a community's strength. Eleanor sat in a rocking chair, a soft quilt over her lap, though the afternoon was warm. She was watching her husband and her son. Caleb was crouched down in the yard, his back to her. Before him sat a small boy of just over a year, with his father's stormy eyes and a halo of his mother's honey blonde hair. The boy's name was Daniel. It had been Eleanor's suggestion, a way to honor the past without being imprisoned by it, to turn a ghost into a blessing. Caleb was patiently showing Daniel how to pull a small wooden horse he had carved. "See, Danny? Like this," he said, his voice, once so rough and clipped, now gentle and full of a deep, rumbling affection. Daniel gurgled with delight and made a grab for the toy, tumbling over into the soft grass with a happy squeal. Caleb laughed, a full, open sound that carried on the breeze. It was Eleanor's favorite sound in the world. She rested a hand on the gentle swell of her belly, where their second child was growing. Life was abundant. It was overwhelming. It was everything. Caleb scooped Daniel up and settled him on his hip, turning toward the porch. He saw Eleanor watching them, a soft, contented smile on her face. He walked over to her, his boots making a familiar, comforting sound on the wooden planks. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss full of the quiet understanding that had grown between them. Daniel patted his mother's cheek with a chubby hand. "He's getting heavy," Caleb murmured, his lips against her hair. "He's getting to be just like his father," she replied, her hand covering his on her stomach. Strong and stubborn, Caleb smiled and looked out over their land. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the valley. The cottonwoods by the creek shimmered in the afternoon light. The mountains stood eternal on the horizon. It was the same view he had looked at for years, the same landscape of his self-imposed exile. But it was no longer empty. It was full. It was overflowing with life, with love, with a future he had never dared to imagine. "I used to think this was a place for being alone," he said, his voice quiet. He looked down at his wife, at the incredible woman who had dismantled his fortress and rebuilt it into a sanctuary for them both. "I was wrong. It was just a place waiting for you to come home."